In the desolate hills of Columbia County, Pennsylvania, the earth itself has been broken.
There is a place here that maps struggle to define. A skeletal landscape where the air hangs thick with a sulfurous
yellow veil. This was once a thriving center of industry, a town built on the deep,
black veins of coal that fueled a nation. But that was before 1962, before the fire started. It was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, creeping rot that ignited within the mines and refused to die. For over 60 years, the inferno has burned deep underground.
Feeding on the seams beneath the foundations of every house and street, the fire turned the town into a literal hellscape.
A place where the ground remains perpetually warm to the touch and the steam vents never cease their rhythmic,
hissing breath. The structures that remain are mere empty husks,
bleached by time and scorched by the heat rising from below. It is a hollowed-out ruin,
a graveyard of industry where the fire continues to consume whatever is left of the past. The soil is poisoned, the pavement is warped, and the silence here is heavy with the weight of a disaster that never ended. In the autumn of 2024, the research team arrived. Their task was clinical: monitor the seismic instability, map the shifting soil, and record the toxic gas levels. They parked their vehicles on the perimeter,
where the road simply ended into a wall of gray, stagnant fog. Dr. Aris stepped out first.
The air was not just cold, it was stagnant, pressing against the lungs with a weight that defied the open space.
The team checked their instruments. They expected the erratic hiss of gas vents or the low-frequency rumble of the coal fire. Instead, they found total, absolute stillness.
There were no birds, no wind, no movement of any kind. The silence was so dense it felt deliberate,
as if the town itself were holding its breath, waiting for them to cross the threshold. Every member of the team paused, scanning the horizon, but the ruins offered no feedback, just empty frames of buildings staring back at them. They had come to measure a disaster, but as they stood at the edge of the desolation,
the silence signaled something far more predatory.
They were not merely observing a geological event. They were walking into a place that had been watching them arrive for miles. The team moved deeper into the outskirts, searching for a structure that still held its roof against the elements. They settled on a shell of a former commercial building, its brickwork crumbling inward like a dying lung. Dr. Aris directed the heavy equipment into the interior, but every footstep triggered a cascade of dust and grit. Outside the threshold, the asphalt told a more violent story. The pavement was not merely broken, it was warped into jagged, twisted ridges, as if the earth beneath had surged and frozen in an instant. These heat-warped scars ran across the road in frantic, irregular patterns, proof that the subterranean fire was nowhere near dormant. The team struggled to level their tripod sensors on the uneven, scorched surface. Every time they tightened a bolt, the ground seemed to shudder in response, settling just enough to tilt their delicate instruments off-center. They worked with rapid, efficient motions, ignoring the heat radiating through the soles of their boots. The structure felt fragile, a hollow ribcage shielding them from the vast, empty town. They unpacked cables and monitors, creating a grid of technology in the center of the debris. As the last of the light began to fade, the team finalized their camp, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was not solid, but a thin, precarious lid over a much deeper, hungrier void. As the final sliver of daylight vanished, the temperature plummeted. The team retreated inside the structure,
sealing the doors with heavy tape to block the encroaching draft. Then, the sound began. It started as a low,
metallic groan deep beneath the foundation, followed by a sharp, piercing hiss that vibrated through the floorboards.
Outside, the vents in the ground ripped open. Thick, yellow plumes of smoke erupted into the air, swirling against the exterior walls like a living tide. The team scrambled to their monitors, but the gas was already permeating the building.
It brought with it a distinct, heavy scent, the sharp metallic tang of copper mixed with the sickening sweetness of ancient,
damp rot. Dr. Eris pulled a respirator over his face.
His movements sharp and frantic as the visibility inside the office dropped to near zero. The smoke was heavy, viscous, and clung to every surface, coating the equipment in a fine, acidic dust. The air grew thick enough to taste. Outside, the hissing intensified.
A rhythmic, mechanical sound that seemed to mock their attempt at shelter. The team stood back to back in the dark,
watching the yellow haze coil through the cracks in the walls. The night had not just brought darkness. It had brought a toxic, suffocating transformation to everything they had spent the day trying to measure. Dr. Eris wiped the acidic dust from his monitor, his eyes straining against the yellow haze. The sensors were screaming, but not with the chaotic, erratic static typical of coal seam fires. He tapped the glass, expecting a hardware glitch, but the readout remained consistent. A waveform pulsed across the screen, slow, steady, and terrifyingly deliberate.
It was not the jagged spike of a rockfall or the low-frequency rumble of shifting strata. It was a heartbeat. He signaled the others to silence their radios, the air in the room suddenly feeling too small, every 4 seconds.
The floor beneath their boots shuddered in perfect synchronization with the monitor's peak. Aris moved the contact microphone to the center of the room, bracing it against the floorboards. The audio feed confirmed the visual data, a deep,
wet thrumming that resonated through the very structure of the building. It was not mechanical. It was not geological.
It lacked the random, destructive nature of the fire. As the team watched, the rhythm accelerated slightly, then locked back into its steady, heavy cadence. Eris looked at his team, his voice barely audible over the recurring vibration.
"This is not the fire," he whispered, his fingers hovering over the recording device. "Something down there is alive."
The ground groaned in response, a long, deep sound that felt less like a collapse and more like a breath. By the third day, the sun refused to break the horizon. Dr. Eris stepped out of the structure to check the perimeter sensors, but the world had vanished. A dense, unnatural fog had crawled out of the vents overnight,
swirling in thick, stagnant curtains that choked the air. He reached out to touch the siding of the building, but his fingers met only cold, damp vapor. He turned to call out to his lead technician, but his voice didn't carry. The fog seemed to absorb the sound, flattening it into a dull thud.
He took 3 paces forward and realized he could no longer see his own boots.
The ground beneath him felt spongy, shifting with a slow, deliberate cadence that made him stumble. He dropped to his knees, clawing at the dirt to find a reference point. But the earth felt soft, almost pliable.
The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, wet clicking of his own heartbeat echoing back at him.
He shouted again, a sharp, panicked sound, but no answer returned.
He was alone in a space that had shrunk to the size of his own reach. The fog was not just obscuring the town, it was actively erasing the path behind him, piece by piece, until he was drifting in a featureless, suffocating void.
Eris crawled forward, his hands scraping against something cold and unnaturally smooth. It was not the jagged rubble of the town hall. He stood, steadying himself against a wall that felt like polished stone, and swept his light through the whiteout. The beam caught a sharp, vertical drop-off just inches from his boots. He stepped back, his breath hitching as he realized the floor had simply ended. He signaled the others, his light flickering against the dense mist, until 2 other beams cut through the gloom. They gathered at the edge of a perfectly circular shaft that plunged deep into the earth. Eris knelt, running his fingers along the rim. It was not blasted rock. It was not timber-reinforced mining work. The walls were bored with impossible precision, spiraling downward into a darkness that even their high-intensity lamps could not pierce. He pulled out the municipal records on his tablet, scrolling through the historical maps of the region. There was nothing here. No utility lines, no ventilation shafts, no industrial transit. The ground beneath them was hollowed out by something that had ignored every blueprint of the town. He looked at his team, their faces drained of color in the harsh light. The shaft hummed with a low, vibrating intensity, and for the first time, they realized they were standing on a surface that was not meant to be walked upon. Dr. Aris pressed his palm against the inner wall of the shaft. He expected the grit of coal-dusted stone or the damp chill of subterranean clay.
Instead, the surface yielded slightly under his weight,
possessing a springy, fibrous resistance. He scraped his thumbnail across the lining, and a long,
thin strip of the material peeled away. It was not rock. It was a dense, leathery substance, charred black and hardened into a rigid,
calcified shell. He shone his light closer, tracing the undulating patterns that ran vertically down the shaft.
These were not tool marks or structural reinforcements. They were veins.
Thick and rhythmic, embedded deep within a structure that looked disturbingly like scorched, fossilized flesh.
The air in the shaft changed, losing the metallic tang of the mines and taking on a sickly,
sweet odor of burnt ozone and rotting organic matter. Aris pulled his hand back as if burned. He looked at his fingers,
now stained with a fine, gray powder that glittered under the lamp. The team stood in silence,
the weight of the realization sinking in. This was not a mining accident.
They were not standing in a tunnel carved through the earth. They were standing inside something that had been hollowed out from within.
The descent began with a slow, deliberate rappel into the dark. Aris led the way, his boots finding purchase on the calcified walls, which felt increasingly brittle under his weight. As they dropped past the first 20 feet, the suffocating heat of the burning coal seams above vanished. It did not fade, it was severed. A sudden, sharp draft hit them, carrying a biting, arctic frost that turned their breath into thick, white plumes. Aris stopped, anchoring his line to a protruding ridge. He pulled a thermal scanner from his belt, expecting to see the intense heat signatures of the mine fire. Instead, the screen flickered, displaying a jagged line that plummeted into the negatives. He tapped the device, but the display remained frozen in a cycle of impossible readings. The air grew brittle, coating their gloves in a thin layer of crystalline frost. This was not a heat sink or a draft from the surface. The environment was physically consuming the warmth, drawing it deep into the throat of the tunnel. Aris looked up, watching the light from the surface grow small and distant, replaced by a cold, blue luminescence emanating from the walls themselves. They were moving away from the fire, yet the cold felt more dangerous than the flames ever had. The shaft bottomed out into a cavernous, circular room. Aris signaled the others to hold their positions as his light swept the floor. The ground was littered with remnants of a life left behind. A rusted tricycle wheel, a stack of water-damaged letters, and a dozen sepia-toned family photographs lay scattered across the dust.
But they were not discarded in haste. Each item had been placed with excruciating precision.
A porcelain doll rested in the center of a perfect, chalk-lined circle, surrounded by rows of fountain pens and wedding bands. Aris knelt, his fingers hovering over a small, wooden spinning top positioned exactly at the north point of the arrangement.
The dust around the objects was undisturbed, suggesting they had been placed here with intent,
not dropped in panic. He picked up a photograph. The faces were blurred, yet the arrangement of the items suggested a deliberate,
calculated offering. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow.
The town had not been evacuated because of the fire. The fire was merely a shroud. These people had been collected,
their belongings sorted and displayed like trophies in a gallery of the lost. The silence of the chamber felt heavy,
expectant, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the next contribution to the collection.
The heavy silence of the chamber was broken by a low, rhythmic vibration that traveled up through the team's boots.
Aris pressed his palms against the floor, expecting the jagged resistance of bedrock. Instead, the surface felt soft, yielding, and impossibly warm beneath his touch. It moved. The floor contracted, a slow,
deep expansion that rippled through the entire cavern. Aris pulled his hands back, his breath hitching as he watched the dust shift in time with the motion. It was not a geological shift or a settling of debris. It was a pulse, a steady, singular heartbeat that vibrated through the very walls they were standing on. He signaled for the team to move toward the perimeter.
But the floor surged upward, forcing them to scramble for balance. The walls,
previously appearing as charred stone, began to glisten with a thick, translucent fluid that leaked from microscopic fissures. The ground beneath them was not earth, it was a membrane. The realization surged through the group like a shockwave. They were not inside a mining tunnel or a bunker. They were standing on the surface of something massive.
Something hidden, and it had just realized they were there. Panic broke the formation as the rhythmic thrumming grew faster, turning into a frantic internal thumping that shook the ceiling until loose debris rained down like teeth.
The thumping beneath their feet slowed, but the tension did not. Aris stood, his flashlight cutting a desperate arc through the smoke.
Then, from the darkness just beyond the beam, came a sound. Click. A sharp,
wet snapping of joints against stone. The team froze. The sound repeated, but this time it carried a cadence. Click, click, click. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and undeniably mechanical in its precision.
Aris held his breath, his hand gripping his equipment until his knuckles turned white. From the shadows, the sound shifted.
It began to mirror the exact tempo of his own panicked gasps. The creature was not just present, it was observing their biology.
Aris whispered a command to retreat, and the darkness instantly threw the sound back at him.
It was his own voice, distorted, stripped of tone, and rendered as a series of wet, clicking syllables. The mimicry was perfect. It copied the exact pitch of his distress,
turning his own warning into a predatory signal. The group huddled together, weapons raised, but the clicking was no longer localized.
It echoed from the ceiling, from the walls, and from the shifting ground beneath them. Something was out there, circling the light, learning how to sound like the very people it was preparing to hunt. The fog deepened, turning from a hazy veil into a thick, sulfurous curtain that clung to their skin. Aris reached out, his fingers brushing the shoulder of the team member ahead. But a sudden,
violent surge of air tore through the tunnel. It was a pressurized blast, hot and smelling of ozone. He stumbled,
his boots sliding on the slick, calcified floor. He shouted for the others to grab onto one another, his voice strained and sharp.
There was no response. The sound of his own cry was muffled instantly,
dampened by the density of the smoke as if the air itself were absorbing the vibration. He lashed out with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the yellow haze only to reveal empty space. He took 3 steps forward, his heart hammering against his ribs, but the floor shifted beneath him, tilting at a sharp angle. He called out again, name after name,
but the only sound that returned was the distant, wet clicking, now echoing from a dozen different directions.
The group was gone. The tunnel seemed to have folded upon itself,
creating a labyrinth of dead ends where there had been a clear path seconds before. He stood perfectly still, listening for the sound of boots on stone or the rustle of gear, but there was only the heavy, suffocating silence of the deep earth.
Aris pushed forward, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The haze ahead thinned into a localized, swirling vortex. He saw them, 3 silhouettes, spaced evenly across the narrow tunnel. They stood with their backs to him, perfectly motionless, like statues carved from the tunnel walls. Relief flooded his chest for a heartbeat. He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the calcified floor. He called out, but the name died in his throat. As he drew within 5 feet, the beam of his light caught their surface. They were not human. The figures were constructed of cooling, gray ash, fused together with jagged, glowing chunks of molten coal. There were no joints, only hardened seams of heat-warped earth. Where a face should have been, there was only a jagged crater of flickering, deep red embers. They did not breathe. They did not sway. They stood anchored to the ground, as if they were part of the tunnel itself. Eris recoiled, his back hitting the cold, slick wall. The silence was absolute, yet the heat radiating from the figures began to blister the paint on his equipment. He realized then that they were not waiting for him to move, they were waiting for him to notice them. As he watched, the ember-filled craters shifted, turning slowly toward his light.
Eris scrambled backward, his boots sliding against the uneven ground as he fled the proximity of the glowing figures.
He turned a sharp corner into a lower gallery, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps.
His light swept the floor and caught a glint of reflective material. He knelt, the beam steadying on a pile of debris. It was the primary sensor array, the one his lead researcher had been carrying only minutes ago. The heavy-duty casing, designed to withstand deep mining impacts, was crumpled like discarded paper. He reached out,
his fingers trembling, and traced the edges of the metal. 4 distinct, deep channels had been carved through the thick alloy,
as if a massive, jagged claw had raked through the steel with effortless force. There were no traces of blood, only a fine dusting of gray soot coating the jagged tears. He stood up, the weight of the reality settling into his gut.
This was not a collapse. It was a hunt. He scanned the surrounding walls and found more. A torn radio harness,
a shattered lens, and a boot, still laced, severed clean at the ankle. The silence in the tunnel felt heavier now, charged with the intent of something that had already tasted the team's presence and was hungry for more.
He gripped his own gear, his knuckles white, knowing he was the last one left to find.
Aris turned to sprint back toward the surface shaft, but the corridor he had traversed moments ago was gone.
In its place stood a blank, seamless wall of charred, calcified skin that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic heat.
He spun around, his light cutting through the haze, only to find the tunnel behind him had narrowed to a jagged slit. He hammered his fist against the wall, but the surface was rock-hard and unyielding. He scrambled into a branching side passage, his boots slipping on the slick floor, desperate to find the incline leading out. He rounded a corner, expecting the main junction, but instead found himself facing the same shredded pile of equipment he had just abandoned.
The geography was not static. It was folding, sliding, and rearranging itself like a closing fist.
He dropped his light, the beam spinning across the floor, revealing the walls vibrating as they contracted. Every time he blinked, the path ahead shifted, blocking his exit and funneling him deeper into the dark.
He realized then that the tunnels were not just underground passages. They were a living,
predatory mechanism designed to ensure nothing left. The walls pressed closer, the clicking sound intensifying until it seemed to vibrate within his own chest.
And the last remaining exit vanished into the tightening, suffocating dark.
Aris stopped running. He pressed his palms against a wall that felt disturbingly like muscle, not stone.
The heat here was not the random warmth of a coal seam, but a steady, regulated temperature.
He watched a vein of glowing embers pulse along the tunnel ceiling, feeding energy directly into the calcified skin of the walls. The history of the town surged through his mind. The 1,962 fire, the decades of abandonment, the government attempts to extinguish the flames. It was not a failure of engineering. It was a failure of perspective.
The fire was not a disaster to be contained. It was a tether.
A permanent energy source designed to keep something ancient and dormant in a state of perpetual hunger. The coal was the fuel, but the town itself was the incubator. He looked at the floor, where the heat intensified in rhythmic waves, matching the thrumming he felt in his own pulse. Everything he had studied, every map he had drawn, was a lie. The town had not been destroyed by accident. It had been harvested. The disaster was a facade, a shroud of smoke and sulfur maintained for 50 years to hide the slow, agonizing growth of a predator that required a city-sized nest to reach maturity.
He was not standing in a mine. He was standing in a digestive tract.
The floor groaned. It was not the sound of shifting strata, but the wet, tearing noise of organic matter losing its tension. Eris felt his boots sink into the surface, the rock beneath him turning to a viscous, glowing sludge. He lunged for a protrusion on the wall, his fingers digging into the calcified skin, but the protrusion softened instantly under his touch. It warped, dripped, and dissolved into a pool of blindingly bright embers. The entire foundation of the tunnel was liquefying. Beneath the crust, a vast, incandescent void opened up, revealing a churning sea of molten coal and white-hot gas. The team scrambled, sliding toward the widening gap as the tunnel floor peeled away like dead skin. There was nowhere to stand. The heat rose in a suffocating wall of pressure, blistering the air and forcing them to shield their eyes. Eris watched the edge of the path crumble into the pit, the molten debris spiraling down into the darkness. They were pinned against the remaining, shrinking ledge. The floor entirely gone, suspended over the furnace. The clicking sound grew deafening, resonating from the very embers now consuming the ground. The earth had opened its mouth, and they were sliding toward the center of the heat. The panic died a sudden, quiet death. Eris stopped clawing at the crumbling ledge and simply watched the embers swirl. It was no longer a struggle for survival. The physics of the room had shifted to accommodate their end.
The clicking sound pulsed in perfect synchronization with the glow of the pit,
a rhythmic cadence that felt like a heartbeat. He looked at his team. They were not fighting the heat anymore. They were waiting. The realization settled over them like a shroud. The 50 years of fire, the toxic gases, the abandoned streets of the town above it had all been a slow-motion preparation for this singular moment. They were not the first to be taken, and they would not be the last. The entity beneath the earth required a specific intensity of energy to complete its cycle, and their presence acted as the final catalyst. There was no escape, because there was no longer a world outside this chamber. The geography of the tunnels had folded into a closed loop, a locked room designed to consume everything that entered it. Eris reached out, his hand hovering over the white-hot edge of the abyss. He understood now. The hunger was satisfied, and the silence that followed was not an absence of sound, but an invitation. The fog crept upward, thick and yellow, swallowing the remaining ledge until the world beyond the pit ceased to exist.
It was a suffocating shroud that tasted of copper and ancient, unburied things.
The clicking accelerated, losing its mimicry of speech to become a singular, jagged frequency that vibrated through bone and marrow. It was everywhere, above, below, and within the very air they breathed.
Eris did not turn his head. There was nothing left to see. The map, the research, and their names had been stripped away,
leaving only the hunger of the earth. The clicking reached a fever pitch, a rhythmic demand that drowned out his own labored heartbeat. It was a sound that had waited half a century to be heard.
The walls of the tunnel vibrated as if in agreement, closing the final gap. Some secrets are buried for a reason. In the suffocating, sulfurous dark of Centralia, the truth is not a discovery, but a trap. As the light from the pit flared to consume the last of the space, the clicking stopped. Total, absolute silence followed. The town was gone. The team was gone. The earth had finally finished its meal, and the ground smoothed over, leaving no trace that anyone had ever been there at all.